Welcome everyone to the Azerbaijan post-race Q&A with myself, Stuffeyy, and what a race it was. Who needs safety cars, eh? I was hoping for one before the race because I did think that, as history tells us, Baku really needs a safety car for it to be quite enjoyable. Otherwise, we end up with a bit of a bore fest. But prior, of course, to the crash at the very end between Sainz and Perez, which we will get to, I was pleasantly surprised with the brilliant racing we had throughout, really, up and down the grid, but most particularly, of course, between Piastri and Leclerc for the win. How brilliant it was to see two drivers in form going at it, and credit to both of them for not making any mistakes. And of course, eventually, Leclerc's challenge to regain the lead from Piastri, he just fell short and was a key part in the end of that crash with Perez and Carlos Sainz. So yes, what a great race. Let's get stuck into it, shall we, and get to your questions. So firstly, let's start with a question relating to that battle at the front with Piastri and Leclerc. What a win it was for the young Australian. He's second of the season and arguably, you'd say, the most in-form driver on the grid at the moment. And we have two questions particularly relating to Oscar Piastri. The first is, Boy Like Belton asks, do I think Piastri is likely to knock Leclerc out of third spot in the championship with his current form? Only 13-point difference now. And TC.C asks, do I think Piastri has now turned into a master of looking after the tyres from being a tyre destroyer of last year? So let's start with Belton's question first. Yes is the simple answer. As I've just mentioned, he is the most informed driver on the grid at the moment. He arguably should have won at Monza as well if it wasn't for his team pitting him from the lead. And he is just completely outperforming everyone at the moment. Of course, Lando, which we'll get to, who knows what he might have been able to have done at the front of the grid, because their qualifying performance, I do think that Lando would have had an opportunity to stick it on pole position, or at least get close to the front row, and would have been involved in that fight. But all hypotheticals, of course. But Piastri, man of the moment, he's definitely on this form, and in that McLaren, can get third in the title championship. Now, if Lando really has a poor remaining 7 races, which I don't think he will, there is the outside possibility he even finishes second. And as I have predicted, Piastri would finish ahead of Lando at the start of the season. I even predicted it and doubled down on that in the middle of the season as well, in the summer break. But I do want Lando to do well because I want there to be a championship fight. But Piastri is showing exactly why he was so hyped, why he's had a stellar junior career, why he won back-to-back F3 and F2 titles. And yeah, it's great to see. That drive was brilliant from him. The fact of it, he just held off sustained pressure from Charles Leclerc. I mean, credit to Charles as well, because I haven't seen anyone all season stay in the DRS of another car ahead for that long before. Pretty much half of the race. I mean, ever since Oscar Piastri overtook him, he didn't leave his rear wing. And that was only till the last few laps where his tyres really hit a cliff and he had nothing left in them to go at Oscar Piastri. And speaking of tyres, well, Oscar Piastri, it was most definitely his biggest weakness, and it's something that, of course, the drivers are complaining about at the moment. George Russell complaining about how the tyres are just, no one can really make sense of them, even saying that he doesn't even think Pirelli can make sense of them. Lewis Hamilton, of course, having issues all year with tyre temps, a number of drivers having issues with them, and even Piastri in this race. At the first stint on the medium compound tyre, on a tyre that generally they've been quite good on throughout the course of the season, regardless of the compound it is. he was kind of left floundering. Charles Leclerc was able to build up a 6-second gap until that pit stop, and when he went onto the hard compound, a bit lower fuel as well, which could have played a factor, that McLaren came alive. So, but interestingly for him is that we've gone through circuits now and raced at circuits where Oscar himself said he really struggled at last year, most particularly after his win in Hungary. Regardless of what happened with the whole changing of position situation, up until those pit stops where he did end up behind Lando, he was controlling that race, especially with the tyre management. And he said afterwards, this was his worst race last year for tyre management. And on the flip side, a year later, he's got that under control. He's learned how to deal with these big modern F1 cars with this ground effect, which, bearing in mind, was a very different type of car to the F2 cars we've got now. The F2 cars have only just been updated to ground effects regulations. So Oscar's come into F1 into this whole new way of driving a car compared to what he's been used to. Even the cars he was doing practice laps in for tyre tests were predominantly the older cars. So the fact of it, it's taken him a year to get up to speed is credit to him. I think it's going to be very rare now that we see drivers get up to speed very quickly. I mean, there are a couple who you could arguably say have done in Colapinto and Ollie Behrman, but even they have struggled with their tyre deck, and we saw that today in Baku where they started to fall back, particularly Behrman. So this is a real testament to Piastri identifying his weakness and working on that, and well, he has got it under control, and it makes such a big difference, because that was really the only area I think he was lacking behind Lando Norris, and why he fell back in a number of races last season, because Lando understandably has a lot more years experience in F1 and managing these Pirelli tyres compared to Oscar. But yes, he is a force to be reckoned with now, and I have seen people touching on Lando again. I have seen people say it took Lando X amount of years to get 2 race wins, and Piastri's done it in 18 months. Look, Lando didn't have a race-winning car other than maybe Sochi that one time. He hasn't had a race-winning car for the last 5-6 years he's been in F1. Oscar Piastri has now had a winning car in the last 12 months since he's been in F1. So sometimes it's just luck of the draw when you get into F1 and you get put into a car like that. Piastri obviously thanking Mark Webber that he didn't sign for Alpine, and that he is now in that McLaren, because he definitely wouldn't be winning races in the manner he is now if he was in Alpine. But yeah, I wouldn't say he's a master still though, Piastri, but I think what he is in particular, he knows where he needs his car to be, and he knew he needed to be in clean air. Now these tyres are, as I said, very peculiar at the moment. They need to be in a specific temperature window. Drivers don't really know what sort of window they need to be in. A 1 degree difference can be the tyres are working correctly to them not working correctly. And what Piastri knows ultimately is that he needs clean air. As he said earlier on in the season, clean air is king. And his engineer even told him not to go for the overtake on Charles Leclerc. And he ignored him, because he knows that clean air is king, and he'll take less out of his tyres. He'd already spent the first stint on the mediums in Charles Leclerc's dirty air, and they died. That was probably a large factor in why his tyres fell off in the manner he did, whereas Charles had the clean air. And this time around, he was able to defend from Charles. And as I said, credit to Charles for staying in the dirty air, in the DRS for as long as he did, because I thought that Ferrari's tyres would fall off a lot sooner than they did on the hards. But credit to Leclerc, but Oscar knew, I need to be out front for my race, for my tyres to last longer than Charles. He knew at some point they were going to fall off a cliff, and you saw that, because with 5-6 laps remaining, Oscar just kind of pulled away from Charles with that extra grip he had as Charles started to fall back into the clutches of Sergio Perez. But yeah, what a performance from both of them. What a performance from Piastri. And if he'd had this form from the start of the season, I don't think it'd be a discussion really that he would be the lead championship contender to Max Verstappen, and that gap would be a lot closer. But it's only in the last X amount of races that he has done this, and that's why Lando is in the position he currently is as the main championship contender. So yeah, I've been really hyped about Piastri. Good to see him come into the become the driver that we all knew, if you followed his junior career, that he had potential to become. And yeah, really excited for the remaining 7 races we've got, and the 3 sprint races, and the next season as well, if he can still have a championship winning and race winning car. Next question is from Ubade Creations 7682. Why is Leclerc struggling after half laps? So I'm not entirely sure what this question is, but I believe and interpreting it as, why was Charles Leclerc slow on his outlap, basically, from the pit stop? Because he did pit 6 seconds ahead of Oscar Piastri, or when Piastri pitted, sorry, it was 6 seconds from the lead of Charles Leclerc. And when Charles came out of the pits, it was barely a couple of seconds. So Oscar Piastri just absolutely cut into that lead of the Ferrari team. Now, I've tried searching to see if Ferrari had a very slow pit stop. I think they did have a suboptimal pit stop, but in particular, the reason why Charles Leclerc lost all that time to Piastri is because he was just able to switch his tyres on so quickly, which actually has been a good characteristic of the Ferrari over the past few years, is that they've been able to just get their tyres up to temperature very quickly. And because Oscar has that extra lap of warmer tyres compared to Charles, he can already pretty much go on the attack. Now, thankfully for Charles, Alex Albon was in between him and Oscar Piastri, and it was for position at the time. It didn't take Piastri long to get past Albon, who was going very long, similar to Lando, and goal hanging for a safety car at that stage of the race. But yeah, Charles's outlap was 3 seconds slower. It was a 2:06 compared to Oscar's 2:03. And I think this is just primarily due to Charles just struggling to get temperature into the tyres. Baku, we heard, as I've mentioned already, Lewis Hamilton in particular complain about getting temperature into the tyres. There is a question on Lewis a little bit later on, but the drivers around here were struggling to get temps into those tyres at Baku, and on that outlap, especially when you've got someone like Oscar Piastri breathing down your neck, and you know you can probably see him in your rearview mirrors, even though he's behind Albon. It's not ideal to literally start pushing on those tyres on an outlap. There is a particular way that drivers would like to drive to bring them in and up to temperature, but Charles couldn't do that. It didn't take him too long, I think, but that initial outlap was slower, of course, than he would have liked, combined with a suboptimal pit stop. So I don't think it's particularly Leclerc struggling after half laps. I don't think he's had this issue before. I think it's just because that was just the nature of the circuit. And yeah, Oscar Piastri, as we said, came alive in that second stint on the hards and was completely different, looked like a completely different car, and looked a lot more comfortable than he was earlier on higher fuel on the mediums. So moving on now to the other papaya car of Lando Norris, who had what looked like, in the end, a decent result. P4, not too shabby for him, finishing 1 position ahead of Max Verstappen. Who would have thought that would have happened after the horrifying Q1 exit he had on the Saturday? Which, look, yes, it wasn't his fault, the yellow flag coming out. However, I still do think that Lando should have just been a bit more committed to finish that lap. He bowed out of it a bit too soon, in my opinion. It was his own decision to do so. When you listen back to the radio communications, the team don't tell him to abort lap. He makes that decision on his own, and I think he should have just lifted and continued on, because who knows, he still might have snuck through, and if he did and the stewards deem him to not have sufficiently have lifted, and because it was a yellow flag and he gets a penalty from it, so be it. Max Verstappen has done this previously, where he's gone for a yellow flag qualified on pole position, or at least on the front row, and received a 5-place grid penalty, I think it was, if memory serves me right. And still, I think, eventually won the race or finished on the podium. And that's what Lando Norris could have done this weekend, because he still has a car that, if it started in the top 10, could have finished on the podium probably quite comfortably, at least involved with that fight at the end with those 4 drivers going for the win, and could have gained more points on Max. But look, in the end, it was a good weekend for Lando. He's closed 3 points closer to Max Verstappen, but it's not obviously the gains that he would have liked, especially in the car he's got, due to that misfortune in the quali. But there are a couple of questions that we have for Lando, relating, of course, to the Drivers' World Championship. And our first comes from Esco Sim Racing. Can McLaren still give Lando team orders priority after this race? The gap between Piastri and Lando is ever closing. So, of course, the big news heading into this weekend, after Monza, of course, the discussions, the outrage, I guess, of how could McLaren let the 2 drivers fight. They not only threw away kind of a massive points gain over Max Verstappen for Lando in the Drivers' Championship, but they also threw away a 1-2 in that race as well, not just from allowing the drivers to fight and they focused on themselves rather than Charles, but then pitting Oscar as well from the lead and giving and handing that win pretty much to Charles Leclerc. So this time around, it was confirmed that they are now going to prioritise Lando, and Oscar isn't going to be told to give up wins, but he is going to be asked to help and support Lando in winning this Drivers' World Championship, as well as the Constructors, which they are now finally in the lead of. They've finally overtaken Red Bull. So I do think 100% they should still prioritise Lando Norris, because as the championship standings currently stand, Lando is still the closest rival to Max Verstappen. He is now 59 points behind Max, with 7 races remaining and 3 sprint races. So he's still in the same position he was prior to this race, where he needed an average of 8 points per race, main race that is. So we're not talking sprint races where he could gain even more of an advantage on Max. And Oscar Piastri, while he's been on great form and he is the in-form driver at the moment, he is still 32 points. That's over a race win, a whole race win, 25 points and more, behind his teammate in second place. And that means he is 91 points, I believe it is, if my maths is correct, behind Max Verstappen. That's more than 3 race wins that he is behind Max Verstappen, whereas Lando Norris is 2 race wins behind. So that's a big, big deficit with only 7 races remaining. So mathematically, yes, Oscar could still win this championship with the remaining races. However, Lando is still ahead of him, and I think he deserves that priority. And look, Lando helped Oscar today, or yesterday as I'm recording this. He helped hold up Sergio Perez. If it wasn't for that, he would have come out behind Sergio Perez, and who knows, Charles might have driven off into the distance once he had his hard compound tyres up to temperature, and Oscar could have got stuck behind Perez for a few more laps and wouldn't have caught Charles, because Charles could then look after his tyres, and the race completely changes on its head then, because they're not in just a very close battle to the end of the race. So once again, Lando has helped his teammate in that regard. He could go back to Hungary as well, and so they should prioritise Lando, and I think it's definitely warranted. And people will say it isn't warranted because Oscar's doing very well at the moment. Well, to be honest, that's recency bias, isn't it? Because people forget how well Lando did in the first half of this season. If you look at the points difference, especially to Lando and Oscar, well, Lando considerably outscored Oscar, hence why he's currently in this position he finds himself in now. And also as well with Lando, you could argue there's a number of races where he could have ended up with the win if McLaren had acted better with their strategy and acted sooner with certain scenarios. So it's not solely on the fact of Lando that he's not closer to Max Verstappen as it currently stands. So yes, with 7 races remaining, they still prioritise Lando. And look, Oscar all he can do is go out there, stick it on pole, and try and win every single race. And if he does, and he wins by happenstance, he wins the championship, then, I mean, fair play. It'll be the biggest miracle in F1 history. But Lando Norris is still not out the realm of possibility of winning this championship, which brings us on to our next question, which is from Levy the Gamer, who has got a two-part question here, but we'll save the second part in a short while. Do I think Lando will still get the Drivers' Championship after this dramatic race starting from the near back? Will he win it? I do. And the reason why I think he will is because I think he is going to. I think he could have been in for the chance for the win this weekend. We've already mentioned qualifying. I think he would have finished on the podium minimum if he had made it through to Q3 and was starting in the top 10 at least. I think so, most definitely. The thing is why I think Lando will is maybe not necessarily due to Lando's performance, but due to Max. That Red Bull does not look like it is getting any better anytime soon. It looks horrendous. I mean, this weekend, Max got clearly outperformed by Sergio Perez. They've clearly changed the car in a direction. I mean, it's a compromise, really, that now suits the way the car is set up, suits Sergio Perez more. It's well documented. Sergio Perez likes a car that's more understeery. Max likes a car that's more on the nose, more oversteery, more responsive. And when Max doesn't have that, it's quite evident that he struggles quite a bit. And he really went through the ringer this weekend and I think snatched a P5. I did predict he'd finish outside the top 5 this weekend. And if it wasn't for the crash at the end between Sainz and Perez, I think he would have done. Well, he definitely would have done, wouldn't he? He would have finished 7th as Lando would have finished 6th. So, yeah, I think all Lando kind of really needs to do, I think, is finish on minimum the podium the next 7 races, plus the sprint races. And I don't really see the way Red Bull are going at the moment that he will finish in the top 5 every single race. I don't think that's guaranteed. I don't think we're going to see a Max Verstappen win for the remainder of this season. And it's, as I said, if Lando gets 2 wins, 3 wins out of the last 7, which is entirely possible, he could, I mean, that's 7 points difference alone without the fastest lap from 1st to 2nd. So he does that and Max finishes in P5. That's massive point swings, or outside the top 5. That's massive point swings in those 3 races alone. And we have 7 races remaining. And Singapore next week is not going to get any better for Red Bull. They're not going to be bringing upgrades that have the desired effect that they want. And this is a circuit that they've not done well at in the past as well. Last year it was their worst circuit. Arguably they made the wrong setup change. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be more of the same this weekend, I think, for Max. And he's going to be hoping for a lot of rain. So it at least nullifies the disadvantage that Red Bull has over the rest of the field at the moment, or the top 4 anyway, or the top 3 of McLaren, Ferrari and Mercedes. But even then, I mean, would Max like a car that's understeering in the rain? There's no guarantee that the car would perform better in the rain, the way it's driving. So, yeah, I still think he will. I think it will probably go down to the end of the season, last race of the season. But surely they got to take, and McLaren as well, we've got to think now, yes, this Drivers' Championship is ours. It's ours to win. And it wouldn't surprise me if we see a very strong Lando Norris come out at Singapore, or the McLarens in general, because they're still overall the outright most balanced and well-performing team, I think, on the grid. So, yeah. Definitely championship still on, and I think he will do it. So we can't not touch on the Sergio Perez and Carlos Sainz crash and the second to last lap, because Sergio Perez was having a great weekend, wasn't he? Outperformed Max Verstappen all weekend. First time he's outqualified him all year, and that's the Sergio Perez that his fans in particular love, and what I think we have expected of Sergio Perez at the bare minimum, to be honest. I mean, let's not beat around the bush here. This is what Sergio Perez is expected to do in that Red Bull. This should be the norm for him. It shouldn't be a rarity, which unfortunately, it has been. But even so, he did deserve, in my opinion, at least a podium, and was unfortunate with that crash. And we have a couple of questions on it, of course. So the first one comes from MMN and some letters and numbers. Do I think Sergio would have been on the podium if not for the crash? Also, do you think Sainz will get a penalty? Of course, I've just mentioned, yes, I do think Sergio would have been on the podium if it wasn't for that. I think the way the crash happened with Sainz, I think Sergio, it would have been close right at the end. It would have been right. It would have been very close at the end. I mean, he did have the position on Sainz there, really. If you think about it, he had the inside there. And yes, let's talk about the crash in itself. Who's at fault? Personally, it's Sainz's fault. I've seen people say Sergio's got all this room over to the left-hand side. He could use it. Yeah, he could, but he's not entitled to. Doesn't have to use it. It's like any time you make an overtake or a defense, it's like an apex. You don't actually have to hit an apex. There's nowhere in the rule book that states you have to hit the apex every single time. If you're defending or you're going for an overtake, as long as you stay within track limits and you leave the car alongside you a car's width and you don't force them off the circuit, then that is fair racing. And well, Carlos Sainz, well, I don't think there was any malicious intent in it. I think it was just a bit of negligence from Carlos and maybe an assumption that naturally Sergio Perez would move over to the left-hand side, but Carlos Sainz has assumed incorrectly that Sergio Perez was doing that. And Sergio Perez probably wanted to squeeze Carlos Sainz as much as he could so that he could ensure that he would have that inside line and have the best opportunity of making an overtake there at the end into turn 3. But yeah, Carlos Sainz at fault. Yes, Sergio Perez, he could have done more, but he's not entitled to do more. And that's why I don't agree with the steward's interpretation that Sergio Perez could have done more. Similar to how they ruled Lewis Hamilton could have done more to avoid the incident when Max Verstappen sent it down the inside of him and they locked up and they banged wheels, of course. I don't get that at the end of the day. Like, they're not in the wrong. They're not entitled to move out of the way for another driver's negligence, shall we say. Because Carlos Sainz, I think, was more focused on Charles Leclerc ahead rather than Perez alongside him, and it was just a misjudgment. And as I said, did it deserve a penalty? No, I think racing incident is probably the right decision. But I do disagree that that Sergio Perez should have done more to avoid it. I just disagree with that. Self-preservation would say, yeah, you'd move over and leave more room, but at the end of the day, what's to stop Carlos Sainz squeezing on the opposite, then doing the same to Sergio Perez and squeezing him all the way up to the other side of the wall to ensure that he can make Sergio Perez brake earlier than he'd like. So there's that to it as well. There's that hypothetical. But yeah, Sainz obviously didn't get a penalty for it. I think that's correct. But I didn't agree with the steward's wording that Perez could have done more. I mean, that's neither here or there. Like, if someone sends it on you and you turn into the corner kind of as you should do, as you're entitled to do, but you could have bowed out of it, and the reason the other guy doesn't get a penalty is because, well, you could have done more to avoid that guy sending it on the inside. I mean, how's that driver's fault? So yeah, I don't think Sergio Perez did anything wrong. I think it was I think it's just poor from Sainz, but not worth a penalty. But it was costly, evidently, for both of them. Mumita Gupta, I hope I pronounced your name correctly there, asked, do I think it was right for Perez to take the risk on the third last lap? Yes. Yeah, I think it was. He had the run on Charles Leclerc, and I think what you have to look back on is that Sergio Perez had to go for that move. He couldn't just wait, in my opinion, because he had Carlos Sainz also breathing down his neck. And Sergio Perez as well was in a Red Bull that was very slow for the speed traps all weekend. It was a car that he didn't get too many opportunities to overtake cars down that back straight because it was a very draggy car. So the fact he got an opportunity to overtake Charles Leclerc at the end there, you've got to take that. Any racing driver would, especially when you've got someone like Carlos Sainz behind you, who is also going to be ready to pounce. If Perez got that run and didn't take that opportunity of making a move on Leclerc, Sainz could have done the same thing on Sergio Perez. So it just happened to be that Leclerc was very committed on the brakes, and they went side by side, and forced Perez to slam on the brakes basically, because technically it was Leclerc's corner as he hit went into the apex first, and Sainz went straight through. And yeah, it was a shame for Sergio. I think he could have maybe, with one more lap as well, he maybe could have got Carlos Sainz, because I don't think Carlos Sainz was within the DRS of Charles Leclerc. I think Charles Leclerc had instantly pulled away from those two because of how wide Sainz had gone. I could be incorrect there, but yeah, with those two fighting, it's most likely that Sainz would have lost the DRS to Charles, unless Charles played some team tactics and backed up on the last lap to allow Sainz to get DRS. But yeah, there's that potential that Perez could have gone for it, could have got the podium back from Sainz if they didn't crash. But yeah, you have to go for that. Any race driver would go for it, any F1 driver. And yeah, when you've got someone else behind you in close vicinity who could also make that same move, you have to. Otherwise, you'd be, imagine he didn't go for that move on Charles and he had the run on him, and Sainz just slipped. I mean, I know he slipped down the inside anyway, but did the same move on Perez. We'd all be sitting there going, well, Sergio, dragging him for the coals, why did you not go for that move? And that kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, you know what I mean? Moving on, we now have some questions about the brilliant rookies who in Colapinto and Ollie Bearman in his second F1 race of the season for a second team. First time around was stepping in for Carlos Sainz when he had appendicitis and had to have his appendix removed. He stepped in and scored points at Saudi Arabia. And then this time around for Kevin Magnussen with his one race ban for having too many points on his super license. And then, of course, Colapinto, who has replaced Logan Sargent for the remainder of this season, both stepping up from F2 this year. And, well, very, very impressive from both of them. Both scoring points at the end as well, thanks mainly due to the crash with Carlos Sainz and Sergio Perez. But also Nico Hülkenberg as well, picking up damage to that. Basically due to picking up debris while going past that crash. Started to have an issue with his car very quickly, which allowed Ollie Bearman and Lewis Hamilton to sneak up the inside into turn 3. But there's a couple of questions here, understandably, on the two after their great weekend at Baku. With the impressive relative results for Colapinto and Bearman in literally their first couple of races, do all the old guys need to be sacked immediately and replaced with the sim kids? Thank you, Space Ghost, for that question. So do all the old guys, do they need to be replaced with the sim kids? So yes, there is going to be a video on this coming very soon, that a large proportion of F1, F2 and F3 drivers now use the sim at home, so iRacing in particular, in their downtime, which is great. It's great to see that translation now of what they do in their spare time happening out on circuit. I've been fortunate to share the virtual racetrack with a number of the F2 drivers, F3, and I've even crashed with Oscar Piastri in an F3 race prior to his F1 career. So that's kind of my claim to fame. But do all the old guys need to be sacked immediately? So they don't need to be sacked immediately. There are still some old guys doing a good job, i.e. Fernando Alonso. And, well, you could say when Lewis Hamilton has the car underneath him at least, and these tyres are up to temperature, he also does a good job as well, the two oldest guys on the grid. But, yes, I do think the teams do need to start looking at the youth, and I think we're starting to see that shift now. Of course, F1's an expensive sport, and they don't want to I think we've seen teams not want to take risks on young drivers, which is why we've seen Bottas moved from Mercedes down to Alfa Romeo / Stake now, and Kevin Magnussen staying Haas and Hulkenberg and stuff. But arguably you could say Hulkenberg has warranted his position, and at least a move to Audi to stay, because he has done a good job, and I think he's exceeded most people's expectations after his return to F1. But yeah, I think we need to start seeing the youth come through. I mean, end of the day, these junior programs that all the teams run, they have to be beneficial at some point, because otherwise, what's the point of having them? And it's always good to have fresh new blood and people to support on the grid of F1. Now, not all of them are going to be successful, and some of them will fail miserably, but a lot of them will succeed in some respects. And I think they'll also be willing to take more risks than the older statesmen who, with respect, I think are just there to pick up a paycheck, and because it's been their life for the last decade, they don't really know what else to do after F1, and they just want to continue. But yeah, I mean, we've got very, very talented drivers making their way quickly through the junior ranks, and yeah, hopefully we see more. I think we've got next year, of course, we've got Colapinto at the moment, who, unfortunately, I mean, look, it has only been 2 races for Colapinto. If he continues this form for the remaining 7 races and the sprint races, then, I mean, he's definitely given James Vowles at Williams a nice headache, and puts the pressure on Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz while they are under contract. They know if they don't perform, then they've got a proven young driver waiting in the wings to step in, and James Vowles could maybe end the contract sooner than he'd think, with someone who's proven and probably wants to be at Williams as well, because I don't think Albon and Sainz are really looking at Williams for the future. They're looking always further up the grids. That's what they're waiting for. But yes, Ollie Behrman is on the grid next year. We've got Kimi Antonelli. We also have potentially Bortoleto going into the Stake F1 car with Bottas on his way out. We could have Liam Lawson next year as well. We could have Isaac Hadjar as well. So another real shift up in the grid, which is only good for F1, and it keeps it fresh. Because while, yes, sports science and is improved, and it's allowing drivers to look after their fitness and their bodies and go on for longer, doesn't always mean that their talent stays around, you know, and that drive sticks around. It's very, very few drivers and individuals in sports who still have that drive going into their late 30s. So credit to Alonso and credit to a Hamilton, still fight at the top and win well, not Alonso win F1 races, but if he had the car, I think he would. And of course, Lewis Hamilton still win F races at the age they are. But yeah, bring it on, guys. Bring it on. The next question is in relation to Colapinto and Behrman still, and it's a real intriguing question here, and I really like this one. Thank you, Niklav Dianos 5136. Apologies if I've butchered your name there. Colapinto and Behrman are both only doing okay this year in F2, yet they perform very well in F1. On the other hand, someone like Sargent finished 3rd in F2 and was thoroughly unspectacular. Put it lightly. Therefore, a question arises. Is F2 a good way to judge a driver's ability in F1 machinery? This is a very good question, Nicola. Thank you. So, he makes a fair point. Colapinto and Behrman aren't winning the championship this year in F2. There's a number of reasons for that, I think. Primarily, this is Behrman's 2nd season in F2, and look, the regs have changed. They've got a brand new car in F2, and the teams that normally do well and are winning those championships or fighting for those championships have taken a little while to get up to speed in F2. Plus, F2 is the most competitive it's been in a very long time. I think Baku, they just had their 15th different race winner of the season. Of course, we have sprint races and feature races. I think it might even be more, but I think 15 is what I heard. That's unbelievable in any form of motorsport. The 15th different winner. That's crazy. So highly, highly competitive. Bortoleto is leading that now, I think, from Isaac Hadjar. But yeah, I don't think F2 is the true barometer of whether a driver will do well in F1. I think what F1 teams are clearly looking for, of course, with Kimi Antonelli, with Max Verstappen bypassed F2, bearing in mind you've got Liam Lawson only doing 1 year in F2, and he went to Super Formula for a year, which said really helped. Behrman, Colapinto. The thing is that there's, whether you win the championship or not is not necessarily determined whether you'll get an F1 seat. There can be, of course, everyone wants to win the F2 championship, because if you win the F2 championship, you've scored the most points, you've been the most consistent, and you're probably quite close to the most wins as well throughout the course of the season. So there is a value still on it, but it's not the be-all and end-all. And yeah, and F1 teams are looking for more than just someone who's, I guess, consistent. They're looking for something special. They're looking for someone who's got attributes and characteristics, raw speed, ultimately, that they want to nurture and develop, and they can see being a good F1 driver. And that's what Kimi Antonelli has. That's what Ollie Behrman has. Colapinto, not many people knew about Colapinto, to be honest. He's won one race in F2 this season, but from what I've seen from Colapinto, whenever I saw him, he was making a blinding overtake, an aggressive overtake. He was on a charge. Like, he knew how to drive a car quick. It sounds stupid, really, doesn't it? But surely all the F2 drivers know how to drive quick. But trust me, there are a few on that grid that shouldn't be there and have been in F2 for way too long and will never have an opportunity of getting into F1. It's just how it is. So there are characteristics that they're looking for, 100%, but someone winning the championship is not the be-all and end-all, or even competing well in the championship. The thing is, teams would much rather have a quick driver who's crashy than a slow driver that's consistent and not crashy. And it sounds, you may be thinking, what? But it's true. They would, in the day, they can nurture someone who's quick and ensure that they don't crash as much. They can develop that out of a driver. But you can't make a slow driver quick. It's a lot more, I mean, you can, but it's a lot more work. It's a lot more time and effort. And we know how time isn't a luxury in F1. So yeah, it's a real interesting question. I think sometimes too much emphasis is put on the championship in itself, but you will see certain drivers. There'll be, if there's someone's been muted to step up into F1, or if they're a reserve driver for the main team, there's a reason why, because they've seen in their performances that they've kind of got what it takes to step up. And that's what I think the likes of Isaac Hadjar have got, Bortoletto. He arguably could do what Oscar Piastri did in win back-to-back F3 and F2 championships. And that's the same with Behrman as well, in regards to that they've seen something in him. It's the manner in which they win as well. So they may only win 2 races in the course of the year, but they may be absolutely phenomenal, pure speed races, similar to kind of what Antonelli's done, really. The 2 races that he's won this year, one was leading from the front in the wet, and he stormed off into the distance at Silverstone, and then at the Hungaroring as well, where he was on the alternate strategy and he ended up on the softs, and he overtook 4 cars at a circuit that is quite known to be difficult to overtake at, and win that race. And it was very impressive, and that's what the teams are looking for. So yeah, good question. Thank you for that, Nicola. And I've already said that Colapinto and Behrman had good performances this weekend, but let's touch on them just a bit more to end this segment with the rookies, because Levy the Gamer, as I said, he had a 2-part question here and asked, what do I think of the performances of Colapinto and Behrman? And I think they had brilliant weekends, brilliant, especially Colapinto. Now, he had a better weekend than Behrman because Colapinto crashed in FP3, I think it was it FP2 he crashed, apologies, I think it was on the Friday, and it was a big moment for him. He did some damage to that car, and that could quite easily knock his confidence for the whole weekend, but it didn't. He qualified brilliantly, made it into Q3, unbelievable. Yes, he outqualified Albon, primarily due to Albon getting that air cool gun stuck in his car and couldn't do a last lap. But even so, like, he was on pace with Albon for most of the weekend. And then they did alternate strategies on the Sunday, and he at one point looked like he was going to overtake and chase down Fernando Alonso, but Alonso being, I think that Aston Martin was a better car this weekend, while not better in Lance Stroll's hands, but Aston Martin was a slightly better car here this weekend than Williams. Colapinto did his best to stay with him and had a very, I mean, even without the crash of Sergio Perez and Carlos Sainz, was going to finish in the points, and that's brilliant and unbelievable and thoroughly deserved, especially at a circuit like Baku where it was tough on the tyres with the temperatures, everyone having issues with those temperatures throughout the race. I mean, yeah, so impressive and a brilliant personality off the circuit as well. He's definitely someone who's he just is enjoying his time. I mean, it's great to see people enjoy what they love doing. And that lad has got a smile on his face and he's just loving this experience in life that he's going through at the moment. And he's 2 races in and he's shown what Williams should have done at the end of last season, because they don't actually have a bad car. I mean, yes, there's certain circuits where it's going to struggle to get points, but it should be like this more often. Someone, or more so on Albon's performance, they do not have a car that is fighting the stake F1 cars week in, week out. It should be competing for points at most circuits. So yeah, fair play to him. It's a bit unfortunate that Sainz is signed up for next year, but look, as I said earlier, he's going to give James Vowles a real big headache at the end of the season if he continues this form. So great for him. And Ollie Behrman as well. Out-qualified his teammate in qualifying, was very harsh on himself that he didn't make it through to Q3, so he could have made it to Q3 as well. A great quali from him. I mean, Hulkenberg is a great benchmark for him. That Haas is not the Ferrari that he drove earlier on in the year. So, I mean, fair play to him for doing that, out-qualifying Hulkenberg by 3 positions. And then when it came to the race, he struggled a bit in the first stint, that's for sure, and he fell down the pack a little bit on the hards, the first kind of phase on the hards, but then towards the end he came on strong and he held back Lewis Hamilton for a very considerable amount of time. Of course, Lewis was having his own woes, but that's no mean feat, knowing you've got Lewis Hamilton chasing you down behind. So yeah, a great performance from the 2 rookies. I'm looking forward to seeing Behrman next year. I'm looking forward to seeing more Colapinto this year. And as I said earlier, bring on the young guns. We need it. The grid needs a freshen up, and it's about damn time. Speaking of Lewis Hamilton, as we made mention of him just there, when we take up to us again, do you think it was a good race from Hamilton considering he got a new part? No, is the short answer to that. No. Lewis Hamilton only finishing inside the points because Perez and Sainz crashed out. He was in 11th place. Is not good enough for Lewis Hamilton, nor is it good enough for Mercedes. Now, yes, he started from the pit lane, so he started technically in 19th position. However, for a car that was quickest all weekend, well, out of the top 4 at least, quickest all weekend in the speed traps where it matters to overtake, I expected a lot more from Mercedes, and especially with a brand new power unit, which is what they put into Lewis Hamilton's car. Now, that wasn't the only thing they put brand new into his car. They put a brand new suspension, and I think maybe tweaked some other parts as well. So he broke part Ferme rules, brand new engine. That's why he started from the pit lane. But yeah, it was poor race from him. He made good early progress. He started on the mediums, but he came unstuck behind Pierre Gasly. He was on the hard compound tyre. Couldn't overtake the Alpine at all. Then made his pit stop, and then he struggled again to overtake Ollie Behrman when he eventually came up to him on the hard compound. So Lewis was complaining all race as well about, particularly there's a quote that he came on, and I'm paraphrasing here, something along the lines of, are you having to see the way that I drive this thing? And they were like, yes, we see. And I think that's in reference to the tyre temps, basically. He was struggling to keep the tyre temps up into a decent window, and makes it very difficult for him for any driver to go and race properly, especially at a circuit where there's very little room for error, no room for error really, other than the escape roads at a circuit like Baku. So for Lewis, no, it wasn't a good drive, but how much of that is down to Lewis, I don't know. I think that now there is, of course, an interview that people are latching onto with Toto Wolff, where he said, yeah, it was a test. We were testing some parts. And you know what? Like, this is what Lewis Hamilton has to accept. There's definitely something going on behind the scenes with Lewis and Mercedes. He's not the #1 driver there anymore. So if they've got new parts that they want to test out on Lewis Hamilton, he's still contracted to them. He might not like it, but he's still with them until the end of the year, and he's paid a pretty penny to do so. And he has to play that role. Now, if he'd qualified ahead of Russell, then yeah, he might not have had that engine penalty and those parts put on his car. But because he was at the back of Formula A, shall we say, it was only Lando Norris who was starting further down than him prior to his pit lane start. They thought, why not do it? Especially at a circuit as well, as I mentioned, like with a brand new power unit and that top speed they had in the last sector. I can't believe he struggled to overtake all race. So something not right with that Mercedes. But yeah, I mean, is there some shenanigans going on in qualifying? He's complained about tyre temperatures again. I don't know. I just think that the Mercedes needs specific conditions to perform well, like they did at Silverstone, like they did at Spa. They need generally cooler conditions. That's really where they thrive. And I think that's primarily due to how sensitive these tyres are, and it just the operating window they're in there works well with the Mercedes car. So if we go to other circuits where we've got overcast conditions and cooler conditions, I think the Merc will do well, but it's not going to do well at, say, Singapore or maybe Brazil or Mexico, where it's very hot and high altitude, as an example. So yeah, odd one for Lewis Hamilton. And Marianne also asks, those cars starting the race from the pit lane, Ocon as well, had mechanical and engineering works on them, but they started the race without any practice sessions. Therefore, couldn't the settings be as optimized as they were before? And yeah, that's totally right. I mean, that's where the testing thing comes from, Lewis. That was kind of a testing race. That was 52 laps or 51 laps, I think it was, of a test for Lewis Hamilton to gather data for new parts or a new development route that they're thinking about, or something for the future that isn't probably going to benefit Lewis Hamilton. It's going to benefit George Russell and Kimi Antonelli for next year. But that's we knew at some point, and he must surely have known at some point throughout the course of this season, if they were in this position, he was going to be used as a development tool. And the driver they want to build confidence up in is not going to be the driver who's going to be their competitor next year, their rival. It's going to be the driver who's going to be their #1, George Russell. So from that perspective, it makes sense. But from Lewis, and as a Lewis fan, it's not where you want to see him. So yeah, he's got his swan song. He's won the British Grand Prix. He's won Spa after George's DQ, but it was a great drive nonetheless. And that's, I think, probably what Mercedes think now. They're like, yeah, we've got you that swan song. We've got you that send-off. Now it's time to use you as a benefit to George and for Kimi Antonelli next year, if you can't get the car into the top 5 or whatever. So yeah, it's a shame, but that's where Lewis Hamilton is, and I think we'll see a different Lewis Hamilton and a more revived Lewis Hamilton next year in Ferrari with a new challenge. And lastly, to end this video, we're going to talk about the team that is consistently finishing last. Yes, I bet you didn't expect this question or this topic of conversation to come up in this video. But yes, Marlin asks, and very importantly asks, what's my opinion on the stake cars as they are falling behind a lot? just a little bit. Do you think they'll have to wait until the new 2026 regs to get back into fighting for points? Short answer is yes. Stake F1, look, they're technically Sauber. It's been Sauber for God knows how long. It was just that the naming rights Alfa Romeo were given away. And yeah, it's that team knows it's going to become Audi, so the owners of that team aren't understandably pumping any money into it. Why would they, with an impending takeover? Audi is going to be taking over Sauber as a whole, so it will be Audi, the company, and as an F1. Now, whether they'll succeed or not is an entirely different question, because they've got their own issues at the moment behind the scenes. Just do a bit of Googling on that, as Audi as a company, and particularly kind of in relation to their sports teams. But yeah, they're fine. They're falling behind a lot because they're just not putting any money into the team and the car. Understandably, why would you put money into a business that you're not going to own anymore from next year or the year after? I can't remember when Audi's takeover actually becomes official. But yeah, they're not going to get better until Audi take them over, until money is pumped back into the team. Now, will Audi turn that around very quickly? I mean, how long's a piece of string? I don't know. There's no guarantee that a team like Audi is going to come in and just hit the ground running. F1's very different. We've seen other companies think they're going to do the same, and it's taken them years to get up to speed. But it can't be any worse than where they are at the moment. While I don't think Zhou Guanyu is a particularly great driver, he kind of just quietly goes about his business. Unlike Logan Sargent, yes, he's had some knocks this year, but for the most part, he only ever really retires if there's a mechanical issue with the car. He's had some crashes, but nowhere near as much as, say, Logan Sargent, who got all that unwanted attention whilst being slow. Zhou Guanyu is slow, but doesn't really get all of that unwanted attention. He's getting more now because he's all the way towards the back of the grid, and the car isn't good enough to even fight for more points. He's being outperformed by his teammate Valtteri Bottas, while he's had the highest finishing position out of the two throughout the course of this season, which means he's higher in the championship standings, even though they've both got nil points. Yeah, it's not been good for either driver. Valtteri Bottas, I think he wants to stay in F1, but looks like they're going to go down the route of a young driver, whether it's within their own academy or Sauber Academy at the moment in regards to Zach Maloney, or whether they go to McLaren and try and loan or sign Bortoleto away from McLaren. Whether the McLaren would allow that, I don't know, but they'd probably much prefer a star driver that's probably as highly rated as Oscar Piastri on the grid in a team that's not going to fret them up front. Is probably a good idea for them. But yeah, that's it. That car isn't getting any better anytime soon. So it's a shame, because you look up the grid, or you look ahead of Stake F1, it's quite tight for those last points positions, isn't it? Really, like, as much as we're going into race weekends not knowing who's going to win the race and finish on the podium, okay, yeah, McLaren we know is always going to be fighting for the win, pretty much. But other than that, we don't know whether it will be Mercedes, whether it will be Red Bull or Ferrari. Similarly, it can be said about the last couple of points positions as well. We don't know who's going to take those last points positions, because we've seen Haas take them, we've seen RB, we've seen Aston. I mean, Stake F1 are the only team on the grid now to score 0 points out of all of the teams. All of them have at least scored a point, and I think they've got multiple points actually. So yeah, real shame for the two drivers, but I think Zhou Guanyu, his time is up, even though he brings a lot of sponsorship and backing. And it sounds like Valtteri Bottas, his time is up as well. He's not going to get as long as a vacation, shall we say, as Kimi Räikkönen just driving around and taking the bag. But yeah, real shame, because we've almost got 10 teams on the grid that can really kind of compete with one another, but not just yet. And it's going to take some time for them or for Audi to come in and turn it around, because it's going to be the same again for next year. And here we go, guys. Thank you for all of your questions relating to the Azerbaijan Grand Prix at Baku. We now head to Singapore. 7 races remaining with 3 sprints. And the championship is still on. I can't believe we've even got a championship battle, to be perfectly honest with you. But surely Lando, his fortune is going to turn around and he'll be able to finish on that podium and close that gap on Max Verstappen, because things don't look to be getting any better. We've also got Connor Pinto, who's looking to continue on this great run of form. He's had 2 good races in a row, got his first points of the season, and can he make it a second race in a row at Singapore? A track where the Williams, I think, will struggle a little bit more because low downforce isn't really the setup and top speed isn't so key at Singapore. One of the most hardest circuits that the drivers face throughout the calendar year. So yeah, really looking forward to it. Supposedly there might be some rain forecast for Singapore, as we've seen in previous years, which always spices things up. But yeah, surely as well, we can't go 9 races without a safety car. Something like that at the moment, isn't it? 7 or 8 races in a row without a safety car. Unbelievable. Surely we're due a couple at Singapore. As they say about London buses, you wait for one forever, then 2 come along in quick succession or at the same time. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the watch-alongs as well. We'll be streaming the practice sessions and the race weekend. It is my birthday this weekend, guys, as well, and I'll be doing the FP3 and qualifying watch-along for you. So hope you guys bring plenty of cake and plenty of well wishes. So I'll see you then. Thanks, guys. See you soon. Bye.